My name is Dallas. I am 30 years old, and I never thought my own father would choose my controlling stepmom Diane over his own son. When I refused to follow her ridiculous rules during college, Dad cut me off completely. But that was nothing compared to what happened at my sister Heather's wedding, where he publicly called me a disgrace in front of everyone. Little did they know that humiliation would be the catalyst for me to turn everything around and make them both regret ever treating me that way. Let me know where you are watching from. Hit that like button and subscribe to hear how I made my family eat their words. My childhood was pretty normal until I turned 10. That was when my mom lost her battle with leukemia, leaving just me and my dad, Frank. Those first few years were tough. Dad worked as an engineer at a construction firm, and he did his best to be both parents to me. He would wake up early to make my breakfast, help with homework, and even learn to sew patches on my clothes when they tore. We had our struggles, but we formed an incredibly strong bond. Every weekend we would go fishing or camping, and those memories became sacred to me. Life went on like this until I turned 15 when Dad met Diane at a company barbecue. She worked in the human resources department, and from what Dad told me, they hit it off immediately. At first, I was happy for him. He deserved to find love again after being alone for so long, and Diane seemed nice enough during our initial meetings. She would bring homemade cookies when she visited, ask about my interests, and even came to a few of my high school baseball games. The wedding happened quickly, just 6 months after they met. I stood beside my dad as his best man, genuinely hoping this would be a good thing for our family. Diane had a daughter from her previous marriage, Heather, who was 3 years younger than me. She seemed sweet but quiet, and I thought having a sister might be cool after being an only child for so long. But things changed almost immediately after the honeymoon. It started with small things. The furniture in our house got rearranged without any discussion. Family photos that had my mom in them mysteriously moved from the living room to hallways, then eventually to closets. Our weekend fishing trips got canceled more and more frequently because Diane had planned other activities. When Dad was at work, Diane would show a completely different side. She would criticize how I loaded the dishwasher, complain about my friends being too loud when they visited, and constantly compare me to Heather, who, according to Diane, was the perfect child. I never felt comfortable bringing this up to Dad because Diane was so careful to act differently when he was around. The most disturbing change was how she slowly but surely isolated Dad from his friends and our extended family. Uncle James, Dad's brother, who used to visit every month, suddenly became unwelcome because Diane claimed he drank too much and was a bad influence. Dad's fishing buddies stopped calling after Diane repeatedly made excuses for why he could not join them. Even my grandparents visited less frequently because Diane would make subtle comments about how their visits stressed her out. At the same time, Diane poured attention and affection on Heather. She got a brand new bedroom set while I kept my same old furniture. When we both needed something for school, Heather's request was urgent while mine could wait. During family dinners, Diane would highlight all of Heather's achievements while barely acknowledging mine. I tried so hard to make things work. I helped around the house without being asked. I maintained good grades. I was respectful to Diane even when she was unfair. But nothing seemed good enough. Dad started changing too. He became more distant, more willing to accept Diane's version of events without question. When I tried to talk to him privately about how I was feeling, he would say things like, "Diane is just trying to create a functioning family," or "You need to try harder to get along with her." By the time I graduated, high school home had become a place I tried to avoid. I applied to colleges that were at least a few hours away, hoping some distance might actually improve our family dynamic. I got accepted to State University with a partial scholarship, and Dad agreed to help with tuition and housing. I thought maybe this fresh start would give everyone some breathing room and help reset our relationships. I was wrong. College started off great. For the first time in years, I felt like I could breathe. My roommate Trevor was easy to get along with, my classes were interesting, and I managed to find a part-time job at the campus bookstore to help with expenses. I was majoring in business with a focus on entrepreneurship, dreaming of someday starting my own tech company. The distance from home gave me perspective, and I began to see just how toxic the environment had become under Diane's influence. But that freedom was short-lived. About a month into my freshman year, the calls from Diane started. At first, they seemed innocent enough. She wanted to know how classes were going, if I was eating properly normal parent stuff. Then came the requests. She needed help cleaning out the garage this weekend. The lawn needed mowing. Heather needed a ride to her friend's house because Diane had a hair appointment. Could I come home and take care of these things? When I explained that I had assignments due and work commitments, Diane would sigh dramatically and say, "I guess your family just is not a priority for you anymore." She would then put Dad on the phone, who would reinforce her guilt trips with his own disappointed tone. What made it worse was seeing the double standard applied to Heather. When she started college 2 years later at a university, only 20 minutes from our house, she was never expected to come home for chores. Her weekends were sacred for studying and socializing, according to Diane. Meanwhile, I was expected to make the 3-hour drive home at least twice a month to help around the house. I met Amy during my sophomore year in an economics class. She was smart, funny, and understood my family situation in a way few others did, having dealt with a difficult stepfather herself. With her encouragement, I started setting firmer boundaries with Diane and Dad. I limited my visits home to major holidays and explained that I needed to focus on my education and campus job. This led to Thanksgiving of my junior year, which would become a turning point. I brought Amy home to meet the family, hoping her presence might help keep Diane on her best behavior. I was wrong. From the moment we arrived, Diane was on the attack. She criticized my haircut as looking unprofessional. She questioned my choice of major, suggesting that business degrees were a dime a dozen, and I would never stand out. When I mentioned a startup idea I was developing for a class project, she laughed and said, "Let us hope you have a backup plan." But the worst came during dinner itself, in front of my extended family who had been invited. Diane waited until everyone was seated and then began interrogating Amy about her family, her career plans, and her religious views. When Amy mentioned her parents were divorced, Diane gave me a knowing look and said Dallas always seems drawn to complicated situations. I suppose like attracts like. I sat there, fork suspended in midair, unable to believe what I was hearing. Dad just kept eating eyes on his plate. Heather looked uncomfortable, but remained silent. It was my Aunt Susan who finally changed the subject, asking Amy about her studies instead. After dinner, I confronted Dad privately in his study. "Why did you let Diane talk to Amy that way? Why did you let her disrespect me in front of everyone?" Dad sighed, looking suddenly older than his 52 years. "Dallas, you need to understand that Diane just wants what is best for this family. She has strong opinions, yes, but her heart is in the right place. You need to try harder to get along with her. I have been trying for 5 years, Dad. Nothing is ever good enough for her. Do you not see how differently she treats me compared to Heather?" "That is not true," he said firmly. "You are just more resistant to guidance." Heather accepts help and advice gracefully. I left his study feeling defeated. That night I discovered something that pushed me over the edge. While looking for extra blankets for Amy in the hall closet, I found a box labeled with my name. Inside was a photo album my mother had made for me before she died. It contained pictures of us together, handwritten notes from her, and mementos from my childhood. This album had disappeared from my room years ago, and when I had asked about it, Diane claimed she had never seen it. The next morning, while Dad was out picking up breakfast and Amy was showering, I confronted Diane in the kitchen. I placed the album on the counter between us. "You told me you never saw this. It was in a box in the closet hidden away." Diane barely glanced at it as she continued washing dishes. "Oh, that old thing. It was collecting dust in your room, so I packed it away for safekeeping. It was not yours to take. These are the only memories I have of my mom." She turned, then drying her hands on a towel. "Dallas, you need to move forward. Clinging to the past is not healthy. Your father has built a new life, a new family. These constant reminders of your mother make that difficult." "She was my mother," I said, my voice rising despite my efforts to stay calm. "And this is my album. You had no right to hide it from me." "Lower your voice in my house," she snapped. "This was my house long before it was yours," I replied, grabbing the album and holding it against my chest. Diane's face hardened. "This attitude is exactly why you struggle to fit into this family. Your sister understands her place. Why cannot you?" "My place. What does that even mean?" "It means respecting my authority in this household. It means accepting that I am married to your father, and that makes me your parent too." "You have never tried to be my parent," I said quietly. "You have only tried to be my boss." That was when Dad walked in, carrying bags of bagels and coffee. He looked between us, sensing the tension immediately. "What is going on here?" Before I could explain, Diane turned on the waterworks. "Dallas is being disrespectful again. I was just trying to have a conversation about family unity, and he started yelling at me." I stood there dumbfounded at how quickly she could twist the situation. "Dad, she hid Mom's photo album from me for years. I just found it stuffed in a closet." Dad looked at the album in my hands, then at Diane. For a moment, I thought I saw doubt in his eyes. But then Diane placed her hand on his arm, and whatever clarity he might have had vanished. "Son, I'm sure Diane was just trying to help you move forward. Holding on to these things so tightly is not healthy." In that moment, I realized I would never win. Not while Diane had such a hold over my father. I took Amy and left that day, cutting our Thanksgiving visit short. On the drive back to campus, I promised myself I would never again let myself be manipulated by Diane or disappointed by my father's inability to see through her. The weeks following Thanksgiving were tense. Dad called a few times, always with the same message: Diane deserved an apology for my behavior. I refused explaining again about the photo album and how hurtful it was to discover she had hidden it from me. These conversations always ended the same way, with Dad sighing and saying we would talk again when I was ready to be reasonable. Christmas break was approaching, and I was dreading going home. Amy invited me to spend the holiday with her family instead, but I knew that would only escalate tensions further. So reluctantly, I packed my bags and headed home for 2 weeks of what I expected to be carefully navigated conversations and forced family activities. What I did not expect was the typed document waiting for me on my bed when I arrived. It was titled "House Rules for Dallas" and contained a detailed list of expectations for my stay. 1. Daily check-in with Diane about my schedule and whereabouts. 2. Mandatory family dinner attendance every night. 3. No guests allowed without 24-hour advance notice and approval. 4. Curfew of 10 p.m. on weeknights, midnight. On weekends. 5. 2 hours of daily household chores, as assigned by Diane. 6. No negative discussions about family matters. 7. Attendance at all family outings and activities, without complaint. The list went on, treating me like a delinquent teenager rather than a 21-year-old college student. At the bottom was a note in Diane's handwriting. "Your father and I feel these guidelines will help make your visit harmonious for everyone." I found Dad in his workshop tinkering with his model train, set a hobby he had maintained since before I was born. I placed the list on his workbench and waited for him to look up. "Dad, what is this?" He glanced at the paper, and then back to the tiny locomotive he was adjusting. Diane thought it would be helpful to set some clear expectations for your visit. There have been some tensions, and this seems like a reasonable approach. Reasonable. I am 21 years old. I am not a child or a house guest. This is controlling and insulting. Dad put down his tools and finally looked at me directly. Son, as long as you are living under our roof, even temporarily following some basic rules is not too much to ask. Diane has put a lot of thought into creating a functional family environment. These are not basic rules, Dad. This is a power play. Heather does not have a list of rules. She comes and goes as she pleases. Heather does not create conflict, he said, his voice hardening. She respects Diane's position in this family. I took a deep breath, trying to stay calm. I respect that Diane is your wife. What I do not respect is how she treats me differently than Heather, how she tried to erase Mom from our lives, and how she manipulates situations to make me look like the bad guy. Dad stood up his workshop stool, scraping against the concrete floor. That is enough. I will not have you speaking about Diane this way. She has done nothing but try to create a stable home for everyone. Dad, cannot you see what is happening? Ever since she moved in, she has been isolating you from everyone who was important to you before. Uncle James barely visits anymore. You never see your old friends. Even Grandma and Grandpa visit less often. Does not that tell you something? A flash of uncertainty crossed his face, but it was quickly replaced by defensiveness. People's lives change. Relationships evolve. That is normal. Not like this, I insisted. Not all at once, and not only the relationships that Diane does not approve of. Dad crossed his arms. Dallas, I'm only going to say this once. You have a choice to make. You can accept Diane's role in this family and follow the reasonable guidelines we have set, or you can find somewhere else to stay during your breaks from school. I stared at him, hardly believing what I was hearing. Are you seriously giving me an ultimatum? I am asking you to be mature and respectful. That should not be difficult. Respect goes both ways, Dad. And I have not seen much coming my way for years now. He sighed heavily. Then maybe you should make other arrangements. I felt like I had been punched in the gut. What about tuition? My housing allowance? Dad looked pained, but his voice was firm. That support comes with the expectation that you are part of this family, which includes respecting its structure and rules. So you would cut me off financially. Because I will not obey Diane's ridiculous rules that do not apply to Heather. The situation with Heather is different. Yeah, because she is Diane's biological daughter, and I am just the inconvenient reminder of your previous life. Dad's face hardened. That is unfair and untrue. This conversation is over, until you can approach it with a better attitude. I left the workshop feeling a mix of anger, hurt, and disbelief. That evening, I packed my things and called Trevor, who lived about an hour away. He immediately offered his couch for the holidays. Before leaving, I left a note for Dad explaining that I loved him but could not accept being treated as less than an equal member of the family. I wrote that I would find a way to continue my education without their financial support if necessary. True to his word, my father cut me off completely. My tuition payment for the next semester never came through. My housing allowance stopped. Even my cell phone was removed from the family plan. It was like I had been erased from the family entirely. The next few months were the hardest of my life. I took on a second job, working nights at a 24-hour diner, while maintaining my daytime position at the campus bookstore. I applied for every scholarship and grant I could find. I moved out of my comfortable campus apartment into a tiny room in a house shared with 4 other students. I ate ramen noodles and peanut butter sandwiches to save money. Despite working nearly 40 hours a week on top of my full course load, I maintained my GPA determined not to let my education suffer. Amy stood by me through all of it, helping me study when I was exhausted from work, bringing me food when she knew I was skipping meals to save money, and providing emotional support when the weight of my family's rejection became too heavy to bear alone. Her strength and loyalty during this time only made our relationship stronger. I tried reaching out to Dad a few times during those months, hoping he might have reconsidered his position. My calls went straight to voicemail. My texts received brief, formal responses. It became clear that the only way I would be welcomed back was if I apologized to Diane and agreed to her terms. My pride and sense of self-worth would not allow me to do that, so I pushed forward, determined to succeed on my own terms. 3 years passed. I graduated with honors despite the financial hardships and grueling work schedule I had maintained throughout my final semesters. The startup idea I had been developing in my entrepreneurship classes had evolved into a promising business plan focusing on innovative logistics software for small businesses. One of my professors was so impressed with the concept that he introduced me to a former student who had connections in the tech investment world. With that introduction and a solid business plan, I secured seed funding for my company Logitech Solutions. We started small with just me and 2 classmates working out of a renovated garage, but our first product launch exceeded expectations. By the end of our first year, we had a proper office and a staff of 8. Amy, who had graduated with a marketing degree, joined the company as our marketing director, bringing her creativity and strategic thinking to our growing brand. Throughout this time, my contact with my family remained minimal. Dad would send brief birthday and Christmas texts. Heather and I maintained a slightly warmer relationship, exchanging occasional messages and updates, though she was careful never to mention Diane or discuss family dynamics. I learned through social media that she had graduated college and taken a job at a publishing house in the city, about 40 minutes from where I now lived, with Amy in our modest but comfortable apartment. It was Heather who reached out on a rainy Tuesday in April with news that would eventually bring me back into the family orbit. She asked if we could meet for coffee, and I agreed, curious about what prompted this unusual request for face-to-face contact. We met at a quiet cafe halfway between our workplaces. Heather looked good, more confident and poised than I remembered. After some awkward small talk about work and weather, she took a deep breath and revealed the purpose of our meeting. "I am engaged," she said, twisting a delicate diamond ring on her finger. "His name is Thomas. He is wonderful. We are planning the wedding for June." I congratulated her, sincerely happy to see her looking genuinely content. "That is great news, Heather. I am really happy for you." She fidgeted with her napkin. "There is more. I want you to come to the wedding, Dallas. It would mean a lot to me." I hesitated the thought of facing Dad and Diane again after all this time, sending a wave of anxiety through me. "I do not know Heather. Things are still pretty complicated with Dad and Diane." "I know," she said quietly. "But you are my brother. It would not feel right without you there." She reached across the table and touched my hand. "Thomas wants to meet you too. He knows how important you are to me." Her words caught me off guard. During our years living together, Heather and I had never been particularly close, largely due to Diane's influence. Hearing that she considered me important enough to want me at her wedding, despite the family tension, was touching. "Will Dad and Diane be okay with me being there?" I asked. Heather nodded. "Dad actually suggested it when we were discussing the guest list. I think he misses you, Dallas. He just does not know how to bridge the gap." That revelation gave me pause. Perhaps time had softened my father's position, or maybe he was just putting on a good face for Heather's sake. Either way, I decided that I would not let my issues with him and Diane prevent me from supporting my sister on her important day. "Okay," I agreed. "Amy and I will be there. Just let us know the details." Heather's face lit up with a genuine smile. "Thank you. This means everything to me." In the weeks leading up to the wedding, I prepared myself mentally for the reunion with my father and stepmother. Amy helped me shop for a new suit and listened patiently as I rehearsed calm, mature responses to potential provocations from Diane. I was determined to be the bigger person to show that I had moved beyond the hurt and anger of the past. The night before the wedding, there was a rehearsal dinner at an upscale restaurant downtown. Amy and I arrived intentionally right on time, neither early enough to have awkward one-on-one encounters, nor late enough to make a conspicuous entrance. Heather greeted us warmly, introducing us to Thomas, a thoughtful, soft-spoken architect who clearly adored her. Dad approached next, looking older than I expected. There were more lines around his eyes and gray at his temples. He extended his hand formally, which I shook, and then surprised me by pulling me into a brief, stiff hug. "You look well, son," he said, his voice gruff. "I hear your business is doing good." "It is," I replied. "How have you been?" "Cannot complain. Still at the same firm, though, talking about retirement in a few years." The conversation was painfully superficial, carefully avoiding any mention of the past 3 years or the circumstances of our estrangement. I introduced Amy, whom Dad greeted politely, but distantly. Diane approached last, wearing an expensive-looking dress and a practiced smile that did not reach her eyes. "Dallas," she said with a nod. "Nice of you to come for your sister." Her tone suggested I was doing Heather a favor, rather than participating in a normal family event. I just nodded in return, determined not to take the bait. "Congratulations on Heather's engagement. Thomas seems like a great guy." Diane beamed at that, taking full credit, as she always did, for anything positive in Heather's life. "Yes, we are very pleased with her choice. Thomas comes from an excellent family." Throughout dinner, I maintained my composure, focusing on Heather and Thomas, rather than the tension with Dad and Diane. When conversation turned to my business, I answered questions honestly but modestly, not wanting to appear boastful. Diane made a few subtle digs about the instability of startups compared to traditional careers, but I let them slide, changing the subject to ask about Thomas's architectural projects instead. By the end of the evening, I felt emotionally drained but proud of how I had handled myself. Amy squeezed my hand as we walked to our car. "You did great," she whispered. "One more day, and then we can go back to our normal lives." If only it had been that simple. The wedding day arrived with perfect June weather, sunny and mild with a gentle breeze. The ceremony was held in a beautiful old church with stained glass windows that cast colorful patterns across the white runner where Heather would soon walk. Amy and I were seated toward the middle, on the bride's side, not quite family of honor, but not relegated to the back either. The ceremony itself was lovely. Heather looked radiant in her gown, and Thomas's face, when he first saw her coming down the aisle, was a picture of pure love and admiration. I felt a genuine happiness for my sister, proud of the confident, kind woman she had become, despite our complicated family dynamics. After the ceremony, we moved to a nearby hotel ballroom for the reception. The space was elegantly decorated with white flowers and soft lighting tables arranged around a polished wooden dance floor. Amy and I were seated at a table with some of Heather's college friends, far enough from the head table to avoid constant interaction with Dad and Diane, which I appreciated. The first hint that something might go wrong came during cocktail hour, when I noticed Dad drinking more heavily than usual. He had always been a moderate drinker, rarely having more than 2 beers even at celebrations, but I counted at least 3 whiskeys before dinner was even served, and he seemed to be in deep, serious conversation with Diane between greeting guests. Dinner passed without incident. The food was excellent, the conversation at our table pleasant, and I began to relax, thinking perhaps my concerns had been unfounded. Then came the time for speeches. Thomas's best man went first, delivering a warm, funny tribute to the groom and welcoming Heather to their friendship circle. Heather's maid of honor, followed with sweet anecdotes about their college days and heartfelt wishes for their future. Then Dad stood up, glass in hand, and approached the microphone. He started well enough, welcoming everyone and thanking them for coming to celebrate Heather and Thomas. He spoke about watching Heather grow up, mentioned her accomplishments in school and her promising career. Standard, proud father material. But then the speech took an unexpected turn. "Some children," he said, his voice taking on an edge, "understand the importance of family. They respect their parents and contribute positively to the family unit." He gestured toward Heather. "My daughter has always been such a child. Respectful, obedient, considerate." An uncomfortable murmur rippled through the crowd as people sensed where this might be heading. I felt Amy's hand close tightly around mine under the table. Others, Dad continued his gaze, now sweeping the room until it landed directly on me. "Choose a different path. They reject family values, abandon their responsibilities, and break their parents' hearts with their selfishness and ingratitude." The room fell silent. I sat frozen, unable to believe what was happening. Was my father really using his daughter's wedding speech to publicly attack me? "My son Dallas sits here today," he said, pointing in my direction, causing hundreds of eyes to turn toward me after years of refusing to be part of this family. A disgrace to the family name and all we stand for. Gasps and uncomfortable shifting filled the ballroom. Heather's face had gone pale. Thomas looked horrified. From her seat at the head table, Diane watched with what I could swear was a small, satisfied smile. "While one child has brought us nothing but pride and joy," Dad continued his words slightly slurred, "now the other has brought only disappointment and pain. Let Heather's example be a lesson to all young people about the rewards of respecting parental authority and family unity." I felt as if I were underwater. Sounds muffled my vision, tunneling. Amy's grip on my hand was now painfully tight, anchoring me to reality. I looked at Heather, saw the mortification and distress on what should have been her happiest day, and made a split-second decision. Without a word, I stood up and walked calmly toward the exit. Not running, not making a scene, just quietly removing myself from the situation. Amy followed close behind. As we reached the door, I heard the microphone being taken away from my father, and the wedding planner's voice awkwardly announcing that it was time for the first dance. In the privacy of our hotel room, the full impact of what had just happened hit me. I paced the floor, alternating between disbelief, rage, and profound hurt. He called me a disgrace, in front of everyone, at his own daughter's wedding. My voice sounded hollow even to my own ears. Amy sat on the edge of the bed, her face a mixture of anger and concern. "What he did was inexcusable, Dallas. That was not about you. That was about him, and whatever twisted narrative Diane has fed him all these years." "Did you see her face?" I asked. She was enjoying it. After all this time, she finally got exactly what she wanted, Dad publicly renouncing me. "But think about how it looked to everyone else," Amy pointed out. "Your father hijacked his daughter's wedding to air family grievances. No one watching that would think you were the problem." She was right, of course, but it did little to ease the sting of the public humiliation. My father, the man who had once been my hero, had denounced me as a disgrace in front of hundreds of people. Whatever remaining hope I had harbored for reconciliation died in that moment. We checked out of the hotel that night, unable to face the prospect of the post-wedding brunch the next day. I sent Heather a brief text apologizing for leaving and making it clear that my issue was with Dad, not her. She responded immediately, "I am so sorry. What he did was unforgivable. Please know I love you, and this changes nothing between us." On the drive home, I was quiet, processing what had happened and what it meant for my future relationship with my family. Amy respected my silence, occasionally squeezing my knee or offering a comforting word, but mostly just being present with me in my pain. By the time we reached our apartment, Exhaustion had replaced the initial shock and anger. As I lay in bed that night, unable to sleep despite my fatigue, a realization slowly crystallized. My father's public attack had released me from any lingering guilt or obligation I felt toward him. He had shown his true colors to everyone, including himself. And in doing so, he had given me the freedom to respond on my own terms, without concern for family harmony that clearly did not exist. The question now was, what would those terms be? In the days following the wedding disaster, my phone buzzed constantly with messages from people who had witnessed my father's speech. Heather's college friends expressed their shock and support. Even a few distant relatives reached out to say they were appalled by Dad's behavior and that they did not share his assessment of me. I appreciated their kindness, but found myself unable to fully engage, still processing my own emotions about the incident. Amy suggested I speak with a therapist, someone objective who could help me work through the complex feelings of rejection, anger, and loss. It was some of the best advice I ever received. Dr. Brennan, a calm, insightful woman in her 50s, helped me understand that my response did not need to be immediate. Strategic responses require clear minds, she said, during our second session. Give yourself time to move beyond the initial emotional reaction. Over the next few weeks, I followed her advice, focusing on my work and relationship with Amy rather than obsessing over what had happened or planning retribution. As the raw pain began to subside, clarity emerged about what I actually wanted from this situation. I did not want revenge. I did not want to hurt my father or Diane the way they had hurt me. What I wanted was understanding, acknowledgement of the truth, and perhaps, if possible, some form of healing. But most importantly, I wanted to reclaim my own narrative. The first step was reaching out to Heather properly. We met for lunch at a quiet cafe, just the two of us. She looked tired, the post-wedding glow dampened by the family drama. "I am so sorry, Dallas," she said immediately. "I had no idea Dad would do that. If I had known, I never would have put you in that position." "It is not your fault," I assured her. "How are you doing?" "That could not have been how you imagined your wedding day ending." She gave a sad smile. "Thomas and I are fine. Everyone has been very supportive. Most people recognized Dad's speech for what it was. The inappropriate ranting of a man who has lost perspective." "Has he apologized to you?" I asked. Heather nodded. "The next day, he seemed genuinely remorseful about ruining the reception, though he still maintained that his grievances with you were valid." She hesitated. "Dallas, there is something I need to tell you. Something I should have told you years ago." She explained that she had always been aware of how differently Diane treated me, how she manipulated situations and isolated Dad from his former support system. I was young and scared of losing her approval. She was all I had after my own father left. So I stayed quiet, even when I knew things were unfair. Her honesty touched me deeply. We were both kids, in a difficult situation. "Heather, I never blamed you." Before we parted, I gave her a letter. I had written detailing my experience in the family from the time Diane arrived to the present day. "You do not have to read this now," I told her, "but if you ever want to understand my perspective fully, it is all there." My next step was reaching out to my father's oldest friend, Brian. He had been my dad's college roommate and best man at his wedding to my mother, but had been effectively pushed out of our lives years ago when Diane decided he was a bad influence due to his divorce. Brian agreed to meet me for dinner, curious about what had prompted my contact after so many years. When I explained recent events, including the wedding speech, he shook his head sadly. "I am not surprised, Dallas. Your father has not been himself for a long time." He went on to explain that he had tried repeatedly to maintain their friendship over the years, but Diane had systematically blocked his efforts. "The last time I saw him, about 4 years ago, I barely recognized him. It was like he had surrendered his identity entirely. Brian, provided valuable insight into my father's vulnerability after my mother's death. Frank was lost without her. Your mother was the stronger personality in many ways, the one who made major decisions. When she died, he was not just grieving, he was adrift. Diane recognized that weakness and exploited it. With Brian's help, I began connecting with other family members and friends who had been pushed away by Diane over the years. Uncle James, who had once been so close to Dad. My maternal grandparents, who had tried to stay involved in my life but were gradually excluded. Dad's former colleagues who remembered him as a different man entirely. Each conversation added pieces to the puzzle, helping me compile a comprehensive picture of how Diane had systematically isolated and controlled my father, and by extension me. I documented everything, creating a detailed timeline with supporting evidence, including text messages, emails, and first-hand accounts. Meanwhile, Logitech Solutions was thriving. Our innovative approach to small business logistics had caught the attention of a major tech publication, which ran a feature story about our company's rapid growth and unique founding story. The article mentioned my journey from being financially cut off during college to building a successful startup, though I had been careful not to share the more personal details of my family situation. What I did not anticipate was how quickly the story would spread through our hometown's business community. Dad's company subscribed to the same tech publications, and several of his colleagues saw the article. The local business journal picked up the story, highlighting a hometown success case. Suddenly, people who had heard my father's version of events for years were seeing a very different picture of the son he had dismissed as a disgrace. Around this same time, I received an unexpected email from Thomas Heather's husband. He explained that Heather had finally read my letter and shared it with him. He wanted me to know that they both believed me completely, and that my letter had given Heather the courage to start setting some boundaries with Diane. "Your sister is stronger than she knows," he wrote, "and having the full truth has been liberating for her." All of these threads came together when Brian called me one evening with surprising news. "Frank reached out to me, Dallas. He wants to meet for coffee. First time in years he has initiated contact." I felt a mix of hope and apprehension. "What do you think prompted this?" "Hard to say. Could be the publicity your company is getting. Could be Heather starting to push back against Diane. Maybe he is finally seeing cracks in the facade." Whatever the reason it seemed, the tables were beginning to turn. The careful, strategic approach was working not as revenge, but as a path to truth. I had reclaimed my narrative, built a successful life on my own terms, and created a documented record of what had really happened in our family. Now, it was up to my father to decide what he would do with that truth. 3 days after Brian's coffee meeting with my father, I received a text message that I had to read several times to believe. "Dallas, this is Dad. I would like to talk if you are willing. No pressure, no expectations. Just talk." I showed the message to Amy, who had been my rock throughout this entire journey. "What do you think?" I asked her. She considered it carefully. "I think you should hear what he has to say, but on your terms, in a place where you feel comfortable and safe." After some thought, I suggested meeting at a neutral location, a quiet park halfway between our homes, on a Sunday afternoon. Dad agreed immediately. When I arrived at the designated bench near the duck pond, Dad was already there, looking smaller somehow than I remembered. The confident, authoritative father figure of my childhood had been replaced by a man who seemed uncertain and aged beyond his years. He stood awkwardly as I approached, clearly unsure whether to offer a handshake, a hug, or maintain his distance. I made the decision for him, extending my hand, which he shook with obvious relief. "Thank you for meeting me," he said as we sat down. "What did you want to talk about?" I asked, keeping my tone neutral. Dad took a deep breath. "First, I want to apologize for what happened at Heather's wedding. It was inexcusable. I embarrassed myself, ruined my daughter's reception, and most importantly, I hurt you publicly in a way no father should ever hurt his child. I nodded, acknowledging his words, but waiting to hear more before responding. Brian showed me the documentation you have been putting together, he continued. The timeline of events since Diane entered our lives. The testimonies from family and friends. At first I wanted to dismiss it all, to defend her and my choices, but I could not ignore the pattern. Once I saw it laid out so clearly. He paused, watching a family of ducks glide across the pond. I have also been talking to Heather more openly since the wedding. She finally told me about things she witnessed over the years, things I never saw or chose not to see. Why now, Dad? I asked. After all this time, after cutting me off, after publicly calling me a disgrace, why are you suddenly willing to see the truth? He rubbed his hands together, a nervous gesture I remembered from my childhood, partly because it became impossible to ignore. Your success. The article about your company people in town, talking about how proud I must be of my son, while knowing I had rejected that same son years ago. But mostly because of what happened after the wedding. He explained that the backlash from his behavior had been immediate and severe. Family members had expressed their disappointment. Friends had distanced themselves. Heather had been deeply hurt. I saw myself through other people's eyes for the first time in years, and I did not like what I saw. It forced me to question everything, including my relationship with Diane. And what conclusions did you reach? I asked, still cautious. That I have been living under the influence of someone who isolated me from everyone I cared about, including my own son. That I allowed her to rewrite our family narrative to cast herself as the victim, and you as the problem. That I failed you as a father in the worst possible way. His voice broke on these last words, and for the first time I saw genuine emotion break through the careful facade he had maintained for so long. I started seeing a therapist, he continued after regaining his composure. He helped me recognize the patterns of control and manipulation that I had been blind to. I am not blaming everything on Diane. I made my own choices. I could have seen the truth sooner if I had been willing to look. He told me that he and Diane were now separated, living in different homes, while he evaluated what he wanted for his future. I do not expect this conversation to fix anything between us, Dallas. I know that trust once broken is not easily rebuilt. I just wanted you to know that I see the truth now, and I am deeply sorry for the pain I caused you. I sat quietly for a moment, processing his words. The apology I had once desperately wanted now felt both satisfying and insufficient. The pain of years could not be erased in a single conversation, but it was a start. I appreciate your apology, Dad. I will not pretend it erases everything that happened, but I am willing to consider it a first step. Relief washed over his face. That is more than I deserve and all I could hope for. We talked for another hour, beginning the long process of rebuilding some form of relationship. I maintained clear boundaries, making it evident that while I was open to reconnection, I would never again allow myself to be manipulated or controlled. Dad seemed to understand and respect this position. Over the following months, we established a cautious new normal. Occasional lunches where we discussed neutral topics like sports and movies. Brief visits where he could see the office space I had built for my growing company. Small steps toward a relationship based on mutual respect rather than obligation. My relationship with Heather grew stronger as well. Freed from Diane's influence, she blossomed into a more confident person, someone who could acknowledge the dysfunctional dynamics of our blended family without feeling disloyal. She and Thomas became regular visitors to our home, and Amy and I attended their first anniversary celebration, a small dinner that felt nothing like the wedding disaster of the year before. As for Diane, I maintained my distance. Dad's separation from her eventually led to divorce proceedings, during which even more manipulative behavior came to light. I felt vindication, but took no joy in his pain. understanding that he had lost years of his life to a relationship built on control rather than love. In the 3 years since that first meeting on the park bench, much has changed. Logitech Solutions has expanded to 3 offices across the country. Amy and I got married in a small ceremony attended by friends and family, including Dad, who respected my request to give a brief standard toast rather than a lengthy speech. Heather and Thomas are expecting their first child, who will know his Uncle Dallas as a regular, loving presence in his life. Dad and I will never have the uncomplicated relationship we had before Diane entered our lives. Too much has happened. Too many hurtful words have been spoken. But we have found a new way to be family, one based on honesty and respect rather than control and obedience. The most important lesson I learned through all of this is that standing up for yourself, even when it costs you dearly in the short term, is always the right choice. By refusing to accept unfair treatment, by maintaining my integrity even when it meant losing financial support and family connection, I ultimately created the space for truth to emerge and healing to begin. I also learned that true forgiveness does not mean forgetting or pretending the hurt never happened. It means acknowledging the pain, holding people accountable, and then choosing to move forward without being defined by that pain. I have forgiven my father not because he deserves it, but because carrying anger would only continue to harm me. If you are facing a similar situation, caught in toxic family dynamics, or forced to choose between your dignity and someone else's approval, know that you are not alone. Standing up for yourself may be the hardest thing you ever do, but it is also the most important. Your worth is not determined by those who fail to see it. Have you ever had to stand up against unfair treatment from family members? Let me know in the comments below. If this story resonated with you, please hit that like button and subscribe to hear more stories of overcoming family challenges. Thank you for listening to my journey from rejection to redemption. Remember, sometimes the family we create for ourselves is more supportive than the one we were born into. I wish you strength and peace on your own path to healing.